All right, welcome back. So where we left off, we were just introducing the idea of experiments. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the mechanics behind experiments. So I will warn you, some of this stuff is going to get nitty gritty. Some of it is going to get very detail focused. With that being said, this is some of my favorite stuff to talk about. I love talking about why these things are good or why these things are less good, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and things like that. So one of the nice things about having this video is that you don't have to take notes on your laptop or on your handwritten notes, but you can just watch this video in case any of this stuff is unclear. So because the online textbook is going to talk about some of these things it's not going to go into as much depth talking about. So whenever we are making experiments, we're drawing causal claims. In other words, we are making a claim that this causes this to happen. That laptops cause folks to not do as well on conceptual information. That large bowls cause people to eat more than they normally would. So we can manipulate variables, but correlation studies cannot do that. The manipulation of that variable is going to be important. It's going to be important because it's going to help us establish things like internal validity, which is one of the things that we talked about last chapter, that correlation studies were really good at temporal precedence. They're really good at kind of showing covariance, but they weren't very good at talking about internal validity. But if we're talking about internal validity, remember what internal validity is making sure that one causes the other. And there are a couple of roadblocks that get in our way. That's why we need to make sure that we are controlling variables. So what is a control? A control is going to be anything that's going to help us try to maintain what behavior should be like. We're going to try to make sure that behavior is not influenced by something. So for a lot of cases, that's going to be like a baseline condition or baseline group, where we are going to try to look at what behavior would be like before the experimenters got involved at all. All right, so think about what were the control groups for experiments 1 and 2. For one of those, it should be kind of easy, right? If you're interested in the influence of laptops, the control condition would be taking notes without laptops. But the control condition for the one with the pasta balls is a little bit less clear, right? You're not letting participants choose the bowls that they would want. Instead, you're assigning those bowls. So we don't know if they would have chosen medium or large, right? Large size bowls. So that information could be a concern. That might be one thing that you could bring up as well, this isn't exactly a control condition, right? Because we don't know what their behavior would be like before we got involved. We don't know a lot of things, and that's what this video right here is all about. So looking at the different kinds of 3 different criteria for causal connections, which we talked about last chapter. 1, does it have covariance? 2, does it have temporal precedence? In other words, can you establish that one came before the other? And 3, is there potentially a third variable that is influencing both of these things? So we're going to establish that there is a causal connection here. We need to make sure that we address all 3 of these things. So establishing covariance is mostly pretty easy. That's just showing that your results are different, that there is one group does one thing and the other group does another thing. Essentially, I mean, that's really simplification, but that's essentially what you're doing. And when you do that, you're able to show that that your independent variable is correlated with one of these results. So, and we don't normally think about it as a correlation, but it is also correlation. And I'm not gonna get into that too much. I'm not gonna expect you to talk about that because that's a little bit of a higher concept. Something you would talk maybe more about in research methods too. But covariance, we're showing that they are related by looking at the results. If there is no difference between these 2 groups, then we can say that there is no covariance, that they are not related. But we are showing here in both of these cases that that independent variable does have some impact on the dependent variable. So we are going to say, yes, that we have established covariance. that between these two things, one is affected by, or your results are affected by one of these things. So the second piece then is going to be looking at making sure that the order of these things matters. You want to establish that the cause happens before the effect. So if we are thinking, and this doesn't quite make a lot of sense for what we're doing here, but if we were to say, have them take a test and then have them take notes in their laptops, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, I know. But we would find that taking notes on the laptop after you take the test is not going to affect the test results, right? It's already happened afterwards. But if we swap it, it does make a difference. Using the laptops first and then taking the test does have an effect. So that gets rid of the directionality problem that we talked about last chapter when we were talking about how things could potentially influence, or how things like stress and sleep are correlated. They share covariance, but it's impossible to say which of those came first. Using things like assigning groups is going to help us establish the temporal precedence. So the third piece of this is going to be the design confounds, and this is going to speak to the internal validity of the experiment. So when we talk about something that might influence our dependent variable, we're going to call that a confound. But it's also the same thing as a third variable problem. You may remember that from last chapter when we were talking about correlations and we talked about polar bear attacks and ice cream sales, right? And we talked about how those things are correlated but they don't cause one another, right? We need to make sure that there's not something like temperature or heat or climate change that are affecting both of those things, right? That there's not a hidden variable there. So we want to make sure that we don't have design confounds or have selection effects. Design confounds are going to be when there's something about our design that is influencing our results that we aren't really noticing or controlling for. And selection effects is whenever our participants themselves are affecting our results. So something about our participants specifically are influencing the results that we are not paying attention to. So let's talk about what each of these things are. So, for example, if you were to look at this, there might be some other design confounds, right? There might be some things that influence what it is that we are measuring here. So, I told you that they were watching a TED Talk. Did we control to see that those participants that they all had the same kind of background with that TED Talk? Probably not, right? We didn't ask them, hey, did you see this TED Talk before? Do you already know this information? That is information that could possibly affect the results here, right? If you have a group of people who go in there and they've all seen this TED Talk before, you can bet they're going to do better on this, right? So in this case, a potential design confound is that you would want to have a video or information that they had never learned before, content that none of them, that they all had equally or the same amount of experience going into it. So the way you would control for that is having a new, video, a new, maybe it's, I don't know, something they'd never experienced before or never heard of before. You would also want to control for prior experience with laptops and notes. Do their other classes have laptops? Do they not have laptops? Those are things that some participants might have more experience with than others, and that could influence the results that we see here. But looking at selection effects, we would also want to make sure that if participants were left to their own devices, if we told them, you can choose to take notes with a laptop or with a notebook, you're probably going to get people who are going to gravitate to what they expect that they're going to do best at, right? And because of that, we're not really getting a good, clear depiction of what the effects of laptops on test taking are, because people are just going to be choosing the method that they like most. And maybe the method they like most is the one that they do best in, right? And if they are doing that, then we can't really trust our results necessarily. Instead, we want to make sure that we randomized that selection and just assigned that to them to make sure that that didn't happen. So, and we can talk about the same thing for the POSTA series of experiments. There are things about our designs that we would want to control for. We want to make sure that everybody got the same kind of pasta, they came into the same dining hall in the same time of day, same day of the week, and things like that. Because you would expect there's going to be a difference probably in people that show up at noon versus show up at 8 o'clock in the morning or 3 p.m. in the afternoon. You would also want to make sure that there aren't individual taste preferences among your participants. So you would want to make sure that this is, not a rare food. This is not a food that requires people to have an acquired taste. Like coffee, for example, is not something that everybody loves. And so you'd want to try to make something that is generic that everybody would probably like to some degree. And then again, if we had participants choose their own bowls, that might influence these results, right? Because if people go and they pick their own bowl, how do we know that, and this gets back to the directionality problem, how do we know that, do they pick the big bowl because they're hungry and they're going to eat more, or are they going to eat more because they pick the large bowl? You see what I mean? So that's why it's important to assign people into one of these two groups instead of letting them choose on their own. So there are different ways that we can test things. It doesn't necessarily have to be just group-based. You can find other ways to tackle this. One way is to do post-test designs, where essentially you're going to assign people to something and then measure their performance afterwards, which is exactly what we talked about with the laptops and handwritten note example, which is, that image is cut off right here. But we could also do a pre-test, post-test design. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to randomly assign groups, and we're going to have one group take a pre-test, do the intervention, or do whatever the independent variable is, and then do a post-test. So in this particular example, we were looking at what are the effects of mindfulness training on GRE test scores. So they come in, we randomly assign them to either a mindfulness class or a nutrition class. Why? Because we want to have a class, probably takes the same amount of time over different information. The reason why we'd want them to do that is because if we randomly assigned them to go into, let's say this condition down here, they took the pre-test and they immediately took the post-test. If there were any differences here in the post-test scores, we would want to make sure that it's not just because, well, they had a class, and it doesn't matter what class it was, all that matters is they had a class. We want to make sure that doesn't come up in as a potential confound. So that's why we have this control condition as a nutrition class. So here, looking at differences between the post-tests would tell us whether or not mindfulness training had an effect. And in this particular article, what they find is that, yeah, it seems like it kind of does have an effect. And so the nice thing about the pre-test, post-test design here is that you can see that for the pre-test, the nutrition group and the mindfulness group had identical scores, right? Which makes sense. That, we're giving them the pre-test, we haven't even done anything yet, and that they're showing the same between groups. But after the training, those with nutrition maybe went down a little bit, probably mostly kind of stayed the same. Those that were in the mindfulness group actually rose. They actually got better at it. And so having this pre-test, post-test, we can show that it's not just the fact that you're taking a class that's making a difference, but it's that you're taking a class in the specific subject because they got better, but they also got better than the other group too. So I'm going to stop this here, and I'm going to talk more in the next video about internal validity and potential confounds that can affect how well we establish causality because of that.